There is such an interesting dilemma, conundrum, I don't know what you want to call it, that happens with podcasters because most hosts think if you want more listeners, well, your audio has to be good and your content has to be great. But if people are finding your show and they're not hitting follow, then the problem is happening before they actually hear your content. And if they're finding your show and they're not hitting follow, then we don't need a crystal ball to tell us that your downloads aren't going to change. And that is why I invited Podcast Hall of Famer and founder of the Earbuds Podcast Collective, Arielle Nissenblatt, to join me here in the studio and unpack why not every podcast automatically earns an audience. And most importantly, what actually makes someone decide whether a show is worth following in the first place. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your podcast binge-worthy. Arielle, welcome to the podcast. I am so excited to have you here today and for everything we're about to unpack.
Thank you for having me. Me too. We did a little pre-show chatter, and I feel like I'm raring to go.
I know. Well, I have been waiting to have this conversation with you because I feel like you have spent so much time curating podcast content, curating it for listening apps, curating it for listening communities, listeners who actually listen to shows. And so I feel like you've got like this front row data on how audiences are actually finding shows out there in the wild. And there's so much talk right now in the industry about getting your show discovered. But when it actually comes down to knowing how to do that, people don't know how to engineer that for their own shows. A lot of people are asking, how do I get more listeners? Or where's the best place to promote my show? But I would love to know from your perspective, what do you think it is that most podcasters misunderstand about how podcast discovery really works?
There are a few things that podcasters need to have locked down before they even start thinking about the discoverability, the discovery element that listeners, consumers are either actively or passively participating in. The first is not every show deserves an audience. Just because you make a show doesn't mean that you deserve an audience, that people are going to find it and listen to it and love it. Just because you've been told on the internet that you should start recording full-scale video episodes and posting clips every single day, just because you also start a blog, you also run a newsletter, just because you also do a million other things, doesn't mean that people will find you. And even if they do find you, that they're going to love you and continue listening to you forever. So let's get that out of the way. I mean, the underlying principle there is that your show needs to be great and it needs to be made for someone, and hopefully many someones, that either they're clamoring for it or you've noticed a need by way of research and you're making the show with all of that in mind. Beyond that, let's answer your question. When we're thinking about getting our own shows discovered, we make something that we're really proud of. We work on it week after week and we don't hear back from the people that are listening. That's often a problem. Or we just are not getting the numbers that we think are out there based on the research that we've been doing about the total addressable market that's available to us. First and foremost, we need to figure out who we're making this for. Underrated tactic is the usage of a survey. And people don't realize that you don't need huge numbers in order for a survey to still be useful. Yes, you need huge numbers in order for a survey to be statistically significant, but a lot of us are not working in statistical significance numbers. We're working in anecdotal, qualitative data numbers. So even just getting that first round of feedback from your super listeners, the people that do tune in every episode, the people that do write to you every once in a while, that do subscribe to your newsletter, even just hearing from them about what segments they like in your show, or should the show be longer, should the show be shorter, that is important data that you can then use to extrapolate and say, okay, if my super listeners like this, yes, of course they're biased because they're my super listeners, but maybe it's reasonable to assume that there are more people that would mimic this behavior. And you can even say out loud on your show, I'm making some changes to the show based on my super listeners and what they've shared with me in this survey. If you disagree with these things, you should have written in, and you still can. The survey's still open. So we need ways to have this dialogue back and forth in order to make our show discoverable within the people that are already aware of the fact that they need this show. there's the idea of making your show discoverable to people who know the keywords to search in order to find you. And then there are people who don't even know that you are occupying the space that the keywords take up that they need. Is the problem something that they've identified? The problem being the thing that they're missing, the content that they're missing, or is it something that needs to be identified for them? So, where are the communities, both online and in real life, that you can show up at with your expertise?
The point you made about the problem and how are we meeting listeners with the problem that we're here to solve and the problem that they can't find us, right? It's kind of a two-part thing. And I always say that it's so much easier if you are clear on the problem that your podcast solves for people and that those listeners actually have that problem and they know they have that problem.
Yeah.
It's not a problem that they don't know that they have because they're going to be actively searching for help and answers for problems that they know they have. So start there. That's
Yeah.
always more helpful than starting with some kind of obscure, and we see this a lot. I see this in the mindset space a lot where it's like this deeper root problem from like your childhood trauma or, whatever that like is underneath there, which might very well be true and it might be very valid. But at the same time, does your listener know that? Or are they just searching right now for like how to, stop this team drama from happening in their workplace because they're trying to manage their team better, right? So getting to the problem that your listener knows that they have. But you mentioned something else and you mentioned listener behavior. And I know for you listening, you know me, like psychology is my jam. And I love thinking about podcasting through this lens because I think this often gets missed. And I think that, yes, it is in part, addressing the problems that our listeners have, addressing the problem of searchability. Where are they hanging out online? What communities are they looking for answers to these problems? How can I insert my podcast there? But then I think also too, something that tends to get overlooked now, and I'm guilty of this because I talk a lot about SEO and all these other ways that you can help people discover your podcast. But word of mouth still has its place. It still has its place.
Yeah.
So is there anything there in terms of what you've noticed that actually makes a podcast recommendable?
Yes.
That makes someone want to talk about a podcast? Can we unpack some of the psychology and listener behavior going on there?
Yeah. I love this question. I think about it a lot. And I notice that to me, what I'm about to say is obvious, but to a lot of people, it's not. But I want people to get this into their heads. Not every person who is looking for a podcast is going to discover podcasts in the same way. You put out what you think is going to be a really great clip of your show. You put out an issue of your newsletter that has an amazing call to action back to the podcast episode that really sells people on the value. Even then, even if it's perfect, maybe they click on it but don't listen right then. Maybe they save it for later. It goes into their mind as wow, that's really valuable and I'm going to check it out when I have time for my next long drive. So, first and foremost, even if you put out the perfect thing at the perfect time, people still have different behaviors. There's also the idea, I write a bunch of podcast newsletters that you mentioned. I'm recommending podcasts constantly. I have a broadcast channel on Instagram where I share once or twice a day-ish what podcasts I'm listening to, a little bit of commentary on it. And I have to remind myself that just because I recommend it right then doesn't mean somebody's going to go listen to it, come back and want to talk about it. And that's even from the curation side of things. But with the newsletters, what I found over the years is that when I'm selling ads within my newsletter, my click rate is pretty good for when it comes to industry standards, my click-through rate, people who are actually, clicking through the links to the podcast recommendations in my newsletter. But based on conversations I've had anecdotally and some statistical significance, because I've been doing this newsletter for 9 years, so I've gathered a lot of data, I've learned that people don't necessarily open the newsletter and click and listen right then. They don't even click at all sometimes. When I read a newsletter, I am looking at it, maybe clocking some things as interesting and checking them out later, remembering that I need to search for them on my podcast listening app. More likely for me, I am opening my podcast listening app right then, searching for it, hitting subscribe, but not hitting play. I'm thinking about listening to it later when I have time. So yes, podcast newsletters, podcast recommendation newsletters are great. They're a great place to get your show featured and in front of an audience that might be interested in you. But even then, you've got to think about the long game that you're playing, getting consistent mentions, getting consistent features in different places, whether it's other podcasts, newsletters in your specific niche, social media accounts, influencers that might want to interview you or just talk about a recent episode that you put out. Even those things are not necessarily going to convert in one fell swoop. And that's a good thing, because what we want to be doing is gradually building an audience of people that discover us, like us, and stick around. When we buy an ad specifically with a platform that guarantees a specific number of downloads, that's when we're going to be put in front of people that are not necessarily our targets. So you are going to have a spike. They are going to try your show, but they are most likely not going to stick around in huge numbers. All of the things that I mentioned up to this point are really important to understand at the baseline, because I don't want people to beat themselves up thinking I put the perfect post out at the perfect time. I spent so much time on social media. I spent money on social media. I hired somebody, and it's not working, quote unquote. It is working. It's just working slowly, and it's working in a way that you can't necessarily measure. You do need to decide if that long game is worth the money, paying somebody to do it, or if you're okay, doing it yourself every once in a while. And like I said, playing the long game. Making your show recommendable in terms of listener behavior, word of mouth is huge. Word of mouth, it really is still huge. Lauren Passell, who was a guest on your show a few episodes back, and I work together a lot. Recently, Lauren and I went out onto the streets of New York City and conducted a podcast listener survey, very unscientific, where we held signs and we said, come talk to us about podcasts. We got a lot of rejections. I can send you the video. It's hilarious. I put together a supercut of all of the no's that we got, but we got a lot of yeses, and we had a lot of incredible conversations with really valuable anecdotal data. Number one, people discover podcasts by word of mouth. Number two, people discover podcasts by algorithm on YouTube and on Spotify. Number three, people discover podcasts by listening to other podcasts and hearing an ad or a host read or a genuine endorsement from the host that they trust. These are big ways that people discover, and that people actually cite as ways that they discover podcasts. So that's really cool data. The word of mouth thing, they're not obviously saying word of mouth. They're saying, oh, my friends talked about it, or I saw it here, or somebody mentioned on, some in a guest lecture at my college or whatever. In order to become word of mouth recommendable, a lot needs to happen within a specific community. And a lot of the work there is showing up in those communities and being really good at what you do, not just on the podcast, but also in the comments on other people's posts on social media, but not necessarily always pointing back to your own show. Giving value so much, so often that people love what you do. They go to your profile, they eventually click and love you. It takes a long time. Takes a long time to become word of mouth recommendable, but if you can get on that train, that's awesome.
Well, and you make an important point too about the organic side of it being slow. It is slow. And I think this winds up being the frustration for a lot of people, is because, they're looking at download numbers, they're not looking deeper into the analytics of the true health of their podcast. And so that feels discouraging week over week, not seeing those numbers move. And then they're like, yes, I'm doing all this effort, putting out social media posts and all these things, but the organic marketing is slow. It is, no matter what industry you're in. It is, if you're marketing a business, if you're marketing a podcast, I don't care what it is, organic is slow. Paid is fast, but paid is not targeted. It's not as targeted as, organically going into a community of your exact listeners and answering questions, like you were just saying, adding value. And so I think that's something important to recognize as podcasters too, and just to understand, you can market your podcast in a number of ways. There is no true right or wrong answer. And in fact, I'm a big advocate of just go out and test things and find what really works for you.
Me too.
Find what works, but it's going to take time to do that too, right? So, maybe you want to have a combination of organic and paid, but they serve different purposes. And I think that this is just really an important point that leads me to what I truly want to ask you next, which centers around context. And the idea that, context really matters in terms of discovery too. Because if you're just blasting an ad out there for your podcast, you're like, okay, I'm paying for this traffic. Yay, I'm seeing a spike. All of a sudden, all these people are finding my show, but they're not sticking around. Maybe a few of them are. Well, is there a context mismatch? Does it make more sense to spend time on the slow but sticky methods of getting your podcast out there Where do ads have its place? I know this is a very jam-packed question, but I really want to unpack this with you, when it comes to context. So why is context so important when it comes to discovering podcasts? What role does context play in getting someone to actually click through for that ad that they might see, or for that social media post, or for that recommendation that that friend made? Why does that context matter so much?
This is where the value of niche specific newsletters and niche specific influencers, getting in front of those audiences, is so important, because you're there, you've got the context, you're capturing people when they are in their contextual space. Somebody goes to read a newsletter about relationship psychology because they have been subscribed for a while, they like this influencer, and then you have paid for an ad there, or you get an organic mention or some sort of editorial feature. Contextually, those people don't have to make too much of a leap in order to get you, because the value is there. That they are interested in that topic, therefore they are more likely to hit play on your episode or to click through. Same goes for, I'm a big advocate for getting your podcast featured in podcast newsletters. Those are podcast newsletters. So the people that subscribe to those newsletters tend to be interested in discovering new podcasts. That's a broad word. It's not podcasts about X. It's not podcasts for this type of purpose. It's just podcasts in general. So if you get featured in a newsletter, people there contextually are interested in podcasts. Maybe your podcast is the right one for that audience. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's right for just a percentage of all the people that click through and open that newsletter. The more contextual that you can get, the more niche with your targeting, whether it's, getting in front of an influencer who puts out a weekly carousel roundup of podcasts that they're listening to, or being featured in the classified section of a newsletter that people trust. That's a great way to be there contextually for them to serve a purpose, still remembering that just because it's the perfect ad at the perfect time, or the perfect editorially inserted content at the perfect time, doesn't mean it's the perfect time for them to start listening.
I think that's important to note, that just because they see it the first time doesn't mean they're going to engage right away. And so this is why it's important to stay relevant over time. And there's this old adage in marketing where it's like 7 times of exposure, that someone needs to see you before they actually take any kind of action. I think that's true in podcasting. I think it might even be more than 7 times now, because we're bombarded with so much in the course of a day. And so what I'm really hearing loud and clear is that, as a podcast host, you got to be clear on who your show is for. You got to be clear on what problems that you solve for someone, and you got to be clear on where those people are, because that's going to be the fastest path to helping your show get discovered, is by inserting yourself into those communities in a valuable way, in a genuine way, and over the course of time, becoming that top of mind person for someone.
You mentioned a few minutes ago something that I want to go into, which is it worth it to spend time with these slow organic methods for growth, or is it worth it to buy ads? Is it worth it to employ a strategy where you got both going on? And that decision all comes down to, what do you have time for, and what's your tolerance for this long game that you're playing? If you want listeners now because you need to prove to an advertiser or to a client, if you're making the show for a client, that their show is doing well, it might be worth it to buy some ads and get some initial spikes that do hopefully trickle down to people really being fans and loyal listeners or viewers of your content. If you are making a show that's weekly and you have no plans to stop, because you're passionate about this thing and because there's an audience for it, then I'm not saying there's no need for paid ads, but I would deploy them very strategically, and only if you're going to see results based on smaller experiments that you've done. Question for you, to turn the tables back on you, and maybe this is also interesting to your audience to hear this out loud. Who are they, and what's their problem?
Mine is so meta, where it's like, we're really here for podcasters who have tried growing their shows. They are the people who are out there putting in the work. And if you're listening right now, you're one of them. You're showing up consistently every week. You have a message that you feel compelled to share. You feel a calling to share. And you're putting in the hours and not seeing the return you thought you would see on your podcast by now. You've listened to the shows out there on podcasting. You've subscribed to podcasting newsletters, you have tried learning what it is that you're missing or what you need to be doing differently, you still haven't been able to put your finger on why your show isn't growing. So that's really who this show is here to serve, because at the end of the day, we've got a human listening on the other end of those headphones. And if we don't know how to connect with that human emotionally, psychologically, if we don't know how to show them that we understand the problem that they're experiencing and be able to communicate in the way that they would talk about that problem to show your level of understanding, I think as podcast hosts, we have a long way to go in the industry to get better at doing that. And it's really important that we lean into who that, not just who that listener is and, demographically, but also psychologically and psychographically.
Yes. I've been thinking about this for a while. I referenced this earlier, the idea that this seems so obvious to me, but I want to make it so obvious to everyone that you are a consumer of media yourself as a creator. Maybe you don't identify as a media consumer, but you are, no matter what, whether you read books, whether you just scroll social media, whether you love podcasts yourself. For a week, try the following. What sparks your eye as you're scrolling social media? What causes you to click? What is something that you've come across that you didn't think would be of interest to you, but the artwork attracted your eye and that made you go to the next piece? That then made you go to the next piece, that then made you hit subscribe on their YouTube video. A few years ago, I did this and I documented it on Twitter back when podcast Twitter was a thing. And for me, it was very helpful, even just getting into the psychographics. Which colors attracted my eye? What was the call to action in a newsletter that caused me to click and then buy the product that was being talked about? I want every creator to figure out what that means for themselves so that they can then apply it to how listeners might be coming across and synthesizing their messages.
Yeah, let's unpack this in the bonus, because this is important for us to understand. And it's a skill and a muscle we all need to learn how to strengthen as podcast hosts, to almost take a step back from the work that we're doing within our podcast every day and then learn to observe our behavior around podcasts. So Arielle, thank you so much for all that you've shared here. And I'm excited to get into the bonus with you.
So much fun. Thank you for stretching my brain.
And before we break down the small but common mistakes that make a show much harder to share than it should be, I want to shout out our review of the week from Skeptic Metaphysician, who says, and I quote, "I subscribe to a lot of different shows, but there are very few that get me to hit play immediately on publish. This is one of those rare shows that I can't get enough of." Wow, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to leave this review. It means so much to me to get reviews like this, to read reviews like this. I read every single review that comes through on the show, and every review really does help others know that this show is worth their time, because we work really hard here every week to bring you a show that is worth your time. So if what you learn here is valuable and you've never left a review, I'd be really grateful if you would. And then stay right where you are, because coming up next, we are talking about the number one mistake that podcasters make with their email newsletters that trains people to ignore them, and how building just a handful of real partnerships in your niche can grow your show way faster than posting clips and promoting every episode on social. That's all coming up next to help you make your podcast binge-worthy.